What's up everyone, it's Dakota, welcome back to another Modern video, and in kind of celebration of there being a Modern Pro Tour this coming weekend, and of course, I've decided to make the channel all about Modern for the simple fact of kind of paying homage to previous Modern formats and previous Modern Pro Tours leading up to the first Modern Pro Tour that we've had in a long time, and really even in Mythic Championship like history as well. Of course, before I get too deep into Pro Tour Oath of the Gatewatch, which was a Pro Tour that took place February 7th, 2016, I would like to remind you, if you are not already subscribed to the channel, please subscribe and ring the notification bell to support my content. It's free, easy, and it just makes me really happy. If you go into the description of this video, I will have the deck list, like the top 8 deck list from the event linked in the description, as well as my Twitch channel and my Discord server as well. Feel free to follow those links, follow me on Twitch, and join the Discord server, all that fun stuff. So for the uninitiated, Pro Tour Oath of the Gatewatch is obviously the Pro Tour based on the release of the set Oath of the Gatewatch, which is where we saw a lot of cheaper Eldrazi, because up to like this point the Eldrazi cards were meant to be like very expensive, from Rise of the Eldrazi, way back when, you had like Emrakul, which was like a 15 mana spell. You had like Ulamog and Kozilek, who were, these giant cost spells that were very powerful when you cast them, and then were also just very powerful with like the Annihilator. Of course, there were other Eldrazi's that had Annihilator in the text box that also cost a lot of mana. They had big stats. They were essentially just really flashy, big creatures that were very difficult to deal with once your opponent got them into play. And so with the release of Oath of the Gatewatch, we actually saw cheaper Eldrazi in this, and obviously we'll go through them as we kind of go through the deck list. But you had a card like Endless One, which just X mana, and you deal pay however much, and you get to make a creature a 0/0 that has X/1/1 counters on it. This in conjunction with cards like Eldrazi Mimic, which are 2 mana, and when another colorless creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may change Eldrazi Mimic's base power and toughness to that creature's base power and toughness. So like with these two cards in particular, already like super cheap. You keep going down the line. You have Eldrazi Obligator, which was essentially a 3 mana 3/1 with haste that also allowed you to pay a 1 and a colorless, and you could then take a creature from your opponent, untap it, give it haste, and attack them. Which in this metagame in particular, when we look at some of the other creatures we have, where we have cards like Thought-Nuts here, Reality Smasher, even like Vile Aggregates and things like that. Eldrazi Obligator was very, very good, for what it was. In general, like paying 5 mana for a 3/1 is not that good, but when that 3 mana also, that 5 mana that you invested comes with a 3/1, and taking your opponent's 5/5 or 4/4, and being able to kind of put your opponent in a position to where like they still can't really attack, and you're continuing to be on the offensive, is pretty good. You have Eldrazi Sky Spawner, which made a 1/1 when it comes into play that you can sacrifice, add 1 colorless mana to your mana pool. It was able to like get in damage. It's just being like a flyer. Also, just getting to create those 1/1s for the Drowner of Hope was also really nice, because then you can kind of ramp into Drowner of Hope with that and cards like Eye of Ugin, which made your colorless Eldrazi spells cost 2 more to cast. And while you're sitting there thinking like, well, how does Drowner of Hope has blue mana, its mana cost? How does Eye of Ugin reduce the cost of Drowner of Hope? It's blue. For whatever reason, these cards had Devoid in them, which is this card has no color, which also means that like you require a color mana to cast these spells, but on the stack and basically everywhere it is not a blue card, or in the case of like Vile Aggregate and Eldrazi Obligator, they are not red cards. So Eye of Ugin then reduces the cost of those cards. I'm sure that is just simple enough to follow, and for like a lot of players, it was still kind of confusing. Even having some stories of like myself of playing some Devoid cards in Modern and players not understanding the fact that they don't have a color. which is, again, just really weird. Of course, alluded to them before, Thought-Knot Seer, Reality Smasher, probably some of the most popular cards from that time, just from Thought-Knot Seer being essentially a 4-mana 4/4. That's like the best card out of your opponent's hand, and of course when it leaves, your opponent draws a card. Target opponent draws a card, so obviously in like regular modern matches, like if you get rid of it, you're going to get to draw a card. But of course, like in multiplayer games, like you could not be the person to draw a card. But even being a 4/4, like these decks were playing like Dismember, like 4/4 was a big body for the format, or at least, at that time. So it was pretty hard to deal with, and the fact that like you basically, if your opponent like killed it while it was on the stack, they drew a card, and then you just got to take the best card out of their hand, which was still pretty good. And the fact that it was already cheap as it is, that if you just played like an Eye of Ugin or whatever, you were going to be able to cast like the Thought-Knot Seer super early. Reality Smasher, a 5/5 Trample Haste that you could cast on like turn 3 is like nuts. And these two cards in conjunction with any number of like Eldrazi Mimic just turboed out like aggro, where like you play like an Eye of Ugin, you play like 2 Eldrazi Mimics. You could easily then go into something like Eldrazi Temple, cast a Thought-Knot Seer, and then you just have 2 4/4s attacking your opponent on turn 2 with a 4/4 on defense and threatening like a big endless one to further pump up your mimics, and then like crash with Thought-Knot Seer and just deal tons of damage and put a lot of pressure on your opponent early. And like the name of the game in like the blue-red version was that you were just kind of annoying. You had like these big creatures and stuff like Ruination Guide, like giving your colorless creatures +1/+0, meaning that like your spawns that you made, or your Eldrazi Scions that you made, were like 2/1s, which, could eventually hit really hard. You had Drowner of Hope that made 2/1/1s when it come into play, and then you could sacrifice a Scion to tap a creature, which allowed you in those racing situations to then, get in for tons of damage, or, in conjunction with like an Eldrazi Obligator, just like tap down your opponent's board, take their last big thing with Obligator, and crash in for, somewhere upwards of like 12 to like 13 damage, which probably could be enough to end the game after kind of dinking your opponent with cards like Eldrazi Sky Spawner and getting in with like Vile Aggregates and things like that. So that was like the idea of like the Eldrazi deck, especially in the blue-white one. You were just a little bit better against the colorless decks, and then the deck list that we're going to look at here was played by Luis Scott Vargas, of course, which was the more streamlined colorless version. And I believe this was just like better against like the general metagame, and kind of a trend that you'll notice as we kind of look through other Pro Tours and things like that. The colorless deck probably arguably like more powerful. It's just playing like more powerful cards, but was worse, I believe, against the blue-red deck. The difference in this deck being like you were playing like main deck Spellskite, so you could protect your creatures from opposing like Dismembers and things like that. You had like Simian Spirit Guide, so then you could play a Chalice on turn 1, which shut off a lot of like the other like cards that were being played in the format at the time, and just kind of locked your opponent out pretty early. Even getting to set it like on 0 against like some of the Living End decks were like fine. And just kind of like showcasing how this deck was, very powerful. Simian Spirit Guide just enabling like a lot of like gross things, like the fact that you could, essentially be tapped out and then like exile it to cast like a Dismember, or, play an Eldrazi Temple on turn 2 after you played an Eye of Ugin, pitch a Spirit Guide and like Reality Smash your opponent on, turn 2 with an Eldrazi Mimic in play. Like, and you hit your opponent for 10 like on turn 2 is just absolutely insane. Of course, again, there is some like special like deck choices and things like that. Of course, main deck Ratchet Bombs and stuff. You can get rid of endless ones obviously pretty easily just by playing it on turn 2 and getting to leave it up forever, of course, getting to tick up. You see some gut shots on the sideboard was to fight opposing Eldrazi Mimics before they actually get boosted. Dismembers also were kind of nice in conjunction, like if your opponent got an Eldrazi Mimic trigger from, say, a Thought-Knot Seer or Reality Smasher, you could dismember their creature, and if they chose to give the Mimic the power and toughness of the creature, it would actually die for the fact that like Thought-Knot Seer and Reality Smasher would have 0 toughness because Dismember gives it -5/-5 rather than just outright killing the creature. So just some interesting like interactions. So between like these two deck lists, I mean, they were like between like the blue-red version and the colorless version, there were 5 to 6 decks in the top 8 that were Eldrazi. The other two being Affinity, which could feasibly get to the board faster than like the Eldrazi decks. But I believe that like 3 out of the top 4 decks ended up being like Eldrazi decks, and then there was like the blue-red Eldrazi deck versus the colorless Eldrazi deck like in the finals. So just to kind of showcase like the power of this deck, and one of the rare times that like the most played deck in the format ended the most played deck and ended up being one of the most broken decks, actually ended up winning the event that it was in, which we will go over like when we get to the Hogak Pro Tour and things like that. Things did not shake out the way that you would hope, at least for the people registering that card. But just kind of a look into what we call Eldrazi Winter this time, where people were essentially playing like super linear decks to try to combat the Eldrazi menace, and ultimately failing because the blue-red version and like the colors versions were just very powerful and very good. And there's really no way of like there was really like no consistent way of like beating them outside of like in fact getting like some kind of crazy draw and like them not getting chaliced on like turn 1 or turn 2, so definitely to kind of showcase like the power that this deck had from especially like that Pro Tour and going forward into like the Grand Prix and stuff like that after the Pro Tour, which ultimately got Eye of Ugin banned. Eldrazi Temple got to stay, and while we see Tron decks trying to play these Eldrazi and things like that, definitely not near to the power as like the colorless Eldrazi deck. Turns out just getting to play these like some of these cards for free, or play like 4/4s and 5/5s on turn 2, turn 3 is very good, and in Tron doing it on turn 3 is not very ideal, or having to luck into 2 Eldrazi temples to do it. So unfortunately you don't see necessarily any like dedicated Eldrazi decks in this manner anymore, or at least like you don't see them at the top tables of like modern events. But of course, interesting to kind of look back on and see some of these deck lists from this Pro Tour. I mean, it was 7 years ago, or over 7 years ago now, which is crazy to think, because I can remember watching like this Pro Tour from start to finish and just being completely enamored by the format. But yeah, that's going to do it for me in this video. I hope you enjoyed the Eldrazi Winter Pro Tour, kind of like going over these decks and getting to talk about them a little bit. Definitely one of my favorite times in Magic, getting to watch like all the Pro Tours and all the great players and stuff play, and of course coverage was just like top tier. So yeah, if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like on the video, comment down below like if you played during like Eldrazi Winter or things like that. If you have any fun stories or just any stories in general that you want to share, of course would love to hear them. Follow me on Twitch, join the Discord server, all that fun stuff. Hope you all enjoyed the video, and hope to see you all in the next one.